The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
Welcome to Faith Matters. This is Robert Cornegie. I'm the Associate Pastor at Emerald Isle Chapel by the Sea, and I have with me this morning a couple of old hands here. We have Ron Monteperto, who is a teacher at... And it's been so long, Ron, I forgot. At Carteret Community College in critical thinking and political science areas. And we also have Mark Woods, who's the pastor over at Cherry Point United Methodist Church. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Robert. It's
Good to
see
be
you.
back.
It's good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back. It's been a long time. And we've got some great stories to talk about today. There's been a lot of news lately, a lot going on, not only in kind of within the bubble of America and all that's going on here, but around the world, indeed. And so we're going to look at some of these. Of course, we'll begin with some of the breaking news out of the Supreme Court. You know, all the hearings and deliberations were held earlier, and now we're getting the judgments, the decisions that were made from the United States Supreme Court, and we've had a whole slew of them come through lately. And one that the Christian community has been watching very carefully and waiting to hear how the justices would rule on this is the Hobby Lobby case. It's also Conestoga Wood and the Little Sisters of the Poor and others were kind of rolled up in this, although they got the Little Sisters of the Poor got a separate dispensement from the courts on that. But the Supreme Court the headline is that this is from the townhall.com. SCOTUS, which is Supreme Court of the United States, sides with Hobby Lobby, and this is written by Christine Roussel. And here's the lead. In a victory for religious freedom, the Supreme Court ruled today 5-4 in favor of Hobby Lobby Stores Incorporated and Conestoga Wood Specialties Corporation in the case Burwell versus Hobby Lobby. The case was the strongest legal challenge to Obamacare since 2012. And basically, the case is about this HHS contraceptive mandate. Now, the Department of Health and what is HHS? I'm sorry,
Health and Human Services.
Human Services. That's it. That's the word I was looking for. Health and Human Services actually developed this contraceptive mandate after the bill was passed. In fact, it wasn't in the original bill. It was an element that was added on. The ACA, the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, as it's more popularly known, gave the Secretary of Health and Human Services a lot of authority and bringing down some of these decisions. And so they developed this contraceptive that mandated that all employers provide certain forms of contraceptives at no cost to their employees. And so there was a big battle about this. It went to the Supreme Court. And in the majority opinion written by Samuel Alito, this decision concerns only the contraceptive mandate and should not be understood to hold that all insurance coverage mandates, e.g., for example, vaccines or blood transfusions, must necessarily fall if they conflict with an employer's religious beliefs. Nor does it provide a shield for employers who might cloak illegal discrimination as a religious practice. And interesting he put that in there because that's obviously two of the areas that were attested. So why don't we talk a little bit about this? Ron, what do you see happening here? How would you interpret what has taken place?
As usual, I'm of two minds on these matters. It's on the one hand, we sit back and it is a matter of religious freedom. On the other hand, and that's as a Christian, yes, that's great. On the other hand, it also, and no one is really saying very much about this, it reinforces the notion of corporation as person with rights and everything else. And the issue is, once you form a corporation, even if it is a family corporation and formally held, does that guarantee you as a corporate entity certain rights? And again, as a Christian, there's lots to be said about that. So on the one hand, I'm glad that there is a way out, that this particular issue has been resolved, and Hobby Lobby doesn't have to pay for things that it's to which it objects on moral grounds. That's good. On the other hand, it raises another issue about the status of the corporation and relative to the individual, which I think is of relevance to people like us who are concerned, with who come from a basically Christian perspective. Another thing, I think the author of the article is probably not entirely accurate. I don't think this is an attack upon Obamacare or even upon health insurance as such, although there are some people who would see it that way. It's a valid effort to the devil. If the devil is in the details,
yes.
It's a valid effort to cope with those details. I think in the circumstances, it's on the whole, it's kind of a good thing.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, isn't it, that this idea of a corporation being, we consider them legal entities. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is precedent law. I mean, and they have a certain right to speech. They have a certain right to property, to as any entity. We use that sort of technical term for as a person. You're almost granting personhood. Mm-hmm. And of course, where this kind of gets in the weeds is that for instance, Hobby Lobby has willingly supported 16 different forms of contraceptive. There were 4 there were 20 on the list that the HHS put out, and 4 of them actually interrupt conception has occurred, and then these 4 their abortifacients basically stopped, and that's what they were opposed to paying for.
Also, the government really didn't help it. I mean, the government, from everything I've read, failed to demonstrate that it had a compelling interest in this. And part of the reason it failed to demonstrate that was because it had already made so many exceptions. So it's an example of, I don't know what it is. I hope it's good faith on both sides and an effort to find common ground. But on these particular 4, it seems to me there's just nothing else that can be said. And so it went the way that it did. You asked me how I feel about it. I think overall it's a good thing. On the other hand, it raises a number of issues that have been with us for 100 years now as to what a corporation is.
Well, it does bring up that question, doesn't it, Mark, about the public life of faith versus the private life of faith. Yeah, and that seems to be sort of a battleground in our culture right now, doesn't it?
Yeah. The article begins by saying, in a victory for religious freedom, kind of presupposing that this is a victory for religious freedom. And I think on some level, and this is, I think, exactly what Ron was arguing, it is a victory for religious freedom for corporations. for those who are involved in this kind of economic
Closely
system.
held corporations.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Is part of the.
I think that's right.
It's got to come into the discussion. We're not talking about Exxon or.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. But if it's a victory for religious freedom for an individual, I'm not sure that's the case in the way that it kind of treats, which is what Ron said, it kind of allows these corporations to have some kind of religious right that might actually infringe upon in some way the religious freedom of the individual. And I think that gets at private and public to a certain extent. I mean, maybe those things would be somewhat synonymous between public and private religious faiths held there. So I think on one level, it is a victory for religious freedom if seen through the guise of these, what you called, I think, closely held corporations, I guess, if you would say. But it might not be for a kind of more individualistic religious freedom. It might not be as much of a victory for that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's in these things. There's always the double-edged sword, isn't it? You know, it cuts both ways, and I think we may see that come about later on. And it's an important topic for us to discuss this morning, I think, in light of all that's going on. You're listening to Faith Matters on the talk station, and you can hear us every Sunday morning. So look forward to being back in just a little bit with another session. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the talk station in Morehead City. I'm Robert Carnegie, the associate pastor at Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle, and with me today is Ron Monteperdo, a professor at Carteret Community College in political science, and also Reverend Mark Woods, who's the pastor over at Cherry Point United Methodist Church in Havelock. So we've been talking about some of the decisions that are being announced this summer from the Supreme Court. And, of course, the one that everyone was real interested in was the Hobby Lobby case. And it was a 5-4 decision in support of the religious liberties, I guess we could say. And it also had some other interesting issues in it that we sort of touched on, but we probably ought to drill down a little bit into to explain what it means. One of the issues, and all of this is sort of rotating around a decision that was a law that was passed back in the 90s, early 90s, 1992, and signed by President Clinton at that time. It passed unanimously in the House and the Senate, and it was called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the RFRA. And this is the act that says that there's certain boundaries and there's a certain mechanism for determining whether the government can actually impinge on the religious rights of individuals, and it's based on if they can restrict on that on corporations. And so we've seen that being played out, and of course the different justices had different opinions on that. Obviously, 5-4. And part of let me just read a little bit that is released here. This is part of the majority's explanation of why it concluded that for-profit corporations are covered by the RFRA law. As we have shown, Congress provided protection for people like the Hans, who were the owners of Conestoga Wood Specialties, and the Greens of Hobby Lobby, by employing a familiar legal fiction. It included corporations within RFRA's definition of persons, but it is an important to keep in mind that the purpose of this fiction is to provide protection for human beings. A corporation is simply a form of organization used by human beings to achieve desired ends. An established body of law specifies the rights and obligations of the people, including shareholders, officers, and employees who are associated with a corporation in one way or another. When rights, whether constitutional or statutory, we're getting in the weeds a little bit here, are extended to corporations, the purpose is to protect the rights of those people, aforementioned the shareholders, officers, and employees. For example, extending Fourth Amendment protection to corporations protects the privacy interests of employees and others associated with the company. Protecting corporations from government seizure of their property without just compensation protects all those who have a stake in the corporation's financial well-being. And protecting the free exercise rights of corporations like Hobby Lobby, Conestoga, and Mardell, which is another corporation in this suit, protects the religious liberties of the humans who own and control these companies. So, Ron, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I think it's what I said before. I mean, it's someone used the word fiction. Yes, the people who own the corporation have certain rights. So the issue then becomes: where does the corporation stand between government, law, God, authority, and the people who constitute the corporation? That to me is the issue. And as much as I am glad, as I said before, about the result here, I'm still concerned about the larger question of what the presence of the corporation, does the presence of the corporation in some way mediate or have any other kind of impact upon the rights of the individuals who own the corporation? I don't know if that puts it in a
different line,
in a clear way, if it raises a number of alternatives or not.
Yeah.
But see, that's the thing that I'm concerned about.
It's fascinating, isn't it, to think about this legal. We just take it for granted that corporations exist and have meaning and within our culture, but they're actually just artificial constructs.
Exactly.
Of people coming together and acting out their life in commerce, in transference of business and whatnot. I mean, it's a construct.
It's a long time since I've dealt with this, but the question of whether a corporation is a person legally, all right, that's one thing. But then we, given our perspective, is a corporation a person morally? And, how does a corporation stand before God? How is a corporation judged?
It's fascinating. I had a corporation when I had my building business, and I was instructed that it made legal sense for me to create an entity, a corporate entity, and that as the president and chief operating officer of this corporation, the idea was that there was a veil, a legal veil, and that separated me from the actions, the consequences of the corporation, which is a bit of a fiction, actually, because if the corporation of which I was the principal had done something immoral or obviously reckless and against good activity, I could be, the corporate veil could be pierced. Is the term, and they could sue not only the corporation as a corporation, they could sue me individually as an officer of the corporation. So there's a little bit of fiction going on here. Anyway, yeah, and you had a comment.
So I'm just trying to navigate this here around what you're saying is there seems to be that what Robert's talking about, there is that veil there. There is that kind of difference between the people and the corporation, because to protect them sort of financially as well, so that you don't lose everything if something. And yet morally, this veil seems to have been pierced here, because our moral convictions become the same as the corporation's convictions. Is that kind of what you're saying there?
Sort of, yeah.
Because
Correct.
then that creates a kind of dialectic between the corporation as being a person and the person as being a person, in a very fascinating way. I
Well, yeah, I think it's our producer just handed me this, that the RFRA used the term persons. The court made a distinction that RFRA did not say natural persons.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually, I guess you could say there's a natural person and a
unnatural person.
corporate person anyway, to some extent. But so, and the intent was to protect those natural persons closely held to that business, whatever that business was, to protect their religious rights. And when the RFRA was passed and made into law, that's what the Supreme Court was actually using as the tool to try to work through this minefield of things. And they've broken some new ground. This is new ground when it comes to a moral position, a religious position, or a position based on religious mores.
Yeah, this may lead us into a different conversation. If it does, we can go somewhere else. But it does beg the question of whether a corporation itself can be moral. Like the very system that it works within, is that a moral system? Meaning, I mentioned in the break, just in kind of jest, that Hobby Lobby is working against this. They don't want these pills that are post-conception for this kind of thing, and yet they'll buy from China, who has laws on the books that say you have to have an abortion in some respects. So they claim this moral ground, and yet that moral ground is not, it's not. They don't seek to have that moral ground consistent across the board. So what that leads me to believe is, can the corporation, which I think is exactly what Ron, and I think what you're asking is, can the corporation be a moral entity? Is it moral, or is it inherently in what it is and what it has to do to protect the individual not moral? I don't know if that would be bad as in not moral, or just indifferent as in moral. But I mean, that begs the question of, can a corporation in this way, even nonprofit, I don't care, nonprofit, for-profit, whatever, can it be a moral entity? Does it have moral interest here?
Yeah.
And I would probably say no. So if I had to throw myself out there and get
and that was the argument, wasn't it? That's what they were trying to navigate, was how do we protect the closely held Again, we're just talking about closely held corporations. We're not talking about mega corporations where this is a wholly owned corporation.
Perhaps
by
in a few
family.
months we will be talking about.
Well, it may be. We may
mega
be.
corporation.
That needs to be
And that's where
considered.
this can go. That's where we'll be looking at that. But from the readings that I've seen and a little bit of this that I've followed, because it is so complicated, it looks like that the real rub here is that the government can remedy this if it chooses to, but as it has already done in other circumstances and given exemptions and whatnot. It's a question of whether there are other motives involved. But this is the Faith Matters radio show, and we appreciate you being there. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the talk station at 107.1 FM and 1240 AM. And thank you, producer. We're going through some of the news that's been coming out lately, and we've just had a Gallup poll. This sort of segues from our previous one, which is talking about the place of religion in our society and how do we protect those rights and all of that. The Supreme Court's been involved in a bunch of this stuff, but there was a recent survey by the Gallup poll. This is from Gallup Politics on the online. Gallup.com, and it's an article by Frank Newport, and the title of the article is "The Majority Still Says Religion Can Answer Today's Problems." An increasing number of Americans, however, say religion is out of date. So let's look at this. 57% of Americans say that religion can answer all or most of today's problems, while 30% say that religion is largely old-fashioned and out of date. That's interesting, isn't it? Americans have in recent decades become gradually less likely to say that religion can answer today's problems and more likely to believe religion is out of date. So, how do you feel about that, Mark?
Oh yeah, I want to get in on this.
Get in on it.
First of all, I'm gonna disagree with the 57% that religion can answer today's problems. The more I read and study and pray and worship, I think the more questions I have than answers. So I think perhaps it should be that the majority still says that religion can produce more questions than answers, and I think that's a good thing. I think that we live inside those questions. We live inside that mystery of what is happening. The more inquisitive we become, I think the more religious we become. And then the 30% who suggest...
It sounds like you're also saying that the more confused we become.
Yeah, sure. I'd be perfectly okay with confusion. But, and the 30%, I think it was 30% who say that religion is old-fashioned and out of date, I would say, yippee. Religion is supposed to be old-fashioned. It is supposed to be out of date in the sense that it preserves a kind of tradition, or it preserves a kind of a respect for historicity, a respect for where we have come from. I think some of the greatest, historical books that we have, the famous quote, "If we forget history, we're doomed to repeat it," or whatever. Yeah. I think Christianity is there to help us reconcile with our history, take our history a little bit more seriously. So old-fashioned and out of date, I'm totally okay with that. But I do think that Christianity or religion in general, if you get into religion, produces a little bit more questions than it produces answers, I think, on some level.
Well, it's interesting. Gallup's been doing these surveys for a while, and going back. In fact, they have a chart here on the article that goes back to the 1958, when 80% of of Americans answered the question, "Do you believe that religion can answer all or most of today's problems, or that religion is largely old-fashioned and out of date?" 80% said yes to that, that it can answer most of today's problems. Now, that percentage has dropped. In fact, in 2012, it looks like, 2013, it was down to about 53%, but we've actually had a climb back up to 57%. Mm-hmm. But there's been a steady decline. Now, during the 1990s, there was actually an increase. It actually rose up into the six. In fact, in 1990, maybe 2000, there was around. It was at about 68% at that time. But the latest data shows that from their values, and this is from their values and belief survey. So let's see if there's anything. Well, Ron, when you hear these kind of things, what does it make you think?
Well, as a political scientist, that's a very, very bad question to ask. Religion, because it immediately simply begs the question of what religion is.
Right.
And everybody who answers it starts with comes back with his or her own idea of what religion is. So, I'm just inclined to discount it. As a professional political scientist, it would get a C+ in any sort of graduate school seminar, and I think Gallup really ought to know better, and so on. But it does help us to get in certain directions. It raises the question: can churches provide the answer. What is the role of the church in all of this? Obviously, as a member of this panel, I think Christianity is the answer. Obviously, I think that. Okay, then that has to be mediated through a group of institutions. So what we're really talking about is, can religion help? I don't think people are thinking about, maybe they are thinking about God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. But they're also thinking about the institutions that we have created.
Correct.
In order to somehow translate the divine mystery into our daily lives, and to express them, to come to terms with our own history, as Mark says.
Right.
So all of that is mixed up with that, and I'm not surprised that it has declined. When you look at what's happened over the last 30 years, what we have been through, and how religion has become divided, how religion has become, in many respects, so closely identified with institutions, politics.
Yeah.
How other people have eschewed politics and have turned their back on politics completely.
Yeah.
So it's one of those questions. It's one of those polls that I think probably creates more unuseful confusion.
Yeah. Well, when you get into the internals, it's pretty fascinating when you look at the numbers. Like on the national adults, everybody, it was a 57% said yes, it can answer problems. 30% said old-fashioned. Others, no opinion, was 13%. When you get down to those who attend church weekly, 84% said yes, it can answer problems. 11% was old-fashioned, out-of-date. 4% no opinion, and it goes down from there. Religious, where religion is very important in their lives, 80%. Religion fairly important, 40%. Religion not very important, 11%. So statistically, you really do have to get down into the weeds a little bit on these surveys to be able to pull out anything that's of any value whatsoever, because we're just talking about a mean average of 57%. And you're going to come up with about in this country today, you're going to come out almost 50-50 on something like this.
And the way that the question is phrased, too, I wonder if the poll doesn't say more about the ascendancy of science over philosophy and metaphysics than it does about religion.
Yeah.
Meaning perhaps there is more, we want answers, and science seems to be the place in which we are finding answers now, and metaphysics and philosophy seem to not. There's a lot of philosophy graduates who end up not having jobs that they wanted because they studied philosophy, because I think in our society right now, science seems to be the thing that everybody is gravitating to for answers, as opposed to philosophy and metaphysics. So it might say something more about that kind of trend than it does about religion in itself. Also, and the other thing is, I was reading somewhere, I cannot remember, I apologize for that, but I was reading how in the 1950s it was very popular to publicly profess your just undying faith, that it was like you are a staunch religious person, but then privately it was popular during the 50s to doubt that. It was a kind of, but in your private life you doubted whether this is really the case, and blah blah blah. And now it's sort of have flip-flopped. Now it is very popular, which I do in here all the time, is to kind of doubt and say, oh, I doubt these things, and it's very popular to doubt. But then our inner conviction, our inner lives is very staunchly dogmatic in a sense in faith. So that could be another component, that this shows more about those things than it does, particularly, I think what Ron is saying is the question is bad, than it says about religion in general.
That's an excellent point. It's sort of a sad reflection on what has happened because we really, from a scientific point of view, there's been this I don't personally believe it, but there's this competition between God and science. And I personally don't believe that exists. I believe it's the way you interpret the evidence is really the most important thing, and that's where the metaphysics comes into it. But so Gallup has basically said, we're still barely holding our head above the water, church. So let's get out there and talk about our faith and get that thing turned around.
Let's be relevant.
Let's be relevant.
Oh, no, please.
Let's
No.
update the church. Let's get some new things going in there. What's next? What is going to be the next in worship services around America? Well, it really is a fascinating thing to see how the influence of our faith is diminishing in our culture, and how that's we're seeing it in our politics. We're seeing it in our relationship with work. And we have another article that we're going to be talking. We'll be closing probably out with this one in the next segment, but maybe we can introduce it. God and Mammon. This is from the New York Times, and it's a fascinating one. Here's the lead. Jesus drove money changers out of the temple, calling them a den of thieves. Of the prophet-centric worldview, Pope Francis warned, we can no longer trust in the unseen forces and the invisible hand of the market. What's that a reference to? That's Adam's, that was his position on
St. Adam.
St. Adam. To provide economic justice. Others call Christianity and capitalism inextricable. I haven't used that word in a while. Is contemporary capitalism compatible with Christian values? We'll be looking at that when we come back in our next segment. This is Faith Matters on the Talk Station. Thank you for listening. Well, we've saved the best for last. This is going to be, we only have 12 minutes now to talk about a pretty important topic that we're going to be looking at for quite a while. This is Robert Carnegie. I'm at the Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle, the associate pastor there, and I have with me Reverend Mark Woods, who's the pastor over at Cherry Point United Methodist Church in Havelock, and also Dr. Ron Monteperto, who's a professor at Carteret General Hospital. College. I'm getting there. I'm just slaughtering that thing today. At Carteret Community College, which is across the street from the hospital.
That's right.
And hopefully you're staying away from both of them this summer. Sorry, Ron. That's what you get for going away, not being here since April. Yeah, got me all confused. Well, this is a pretty interesting one. This is obviously in the opinion pages of the New York Times, and it's called Room for Debate. And the title of this article is written by Gary Dorian. He's the Reinhold, and I mispronounce that name every time.
Reinhold Niebuhr.
Niebuhr, professor of social ethics at Union Theological Seminary and a professor of religion at Columbia University. And he's writing this article, and it's called God and Mammon. Mammon. Has contemporary American capitalism become incompatible with Christian values? This seems to be the most popular discussion right now, this idea between capitalism as kind of inherently rooted in Christianity, or is it something that has been imposed upon it, or is it the source of it? So let's dig in a little bit. His lead begins with capitalism, like Christianity, is not just one thing. Capitalism operates differently in varying political and cultural contexts, and Western Christianity managed to accommodate the Roman Empire, feudalism, and early nationalism before it accommodated the rise of the bourgeoisie and modern democracy. The perennial question asked here, however, is pressing hard on us again because economic globalization has unleashed the predatory logic of capitalism, devastated trade union movements, and shrunken the restraining capacities of government. Well, let's just begin right there. Let's talk a little bit about that. Ron, I'm going to throw this one at you since you are a political scientist. Give us a little feedback on that.
Well, let's see. We have 12 minutes.
You have 10 right now, actually.
Clearly the development of science and technology, particularly technology, along with communication and blah blah blah, all the things that we talk about, has challenged the ability of societies to regulate and to control economic activity, or say to discipline economic activity for the benefit of the common good, which is one of the purposes of government. The challenge exists. That's demonstrable. Now, one could also argue that the logic of capitalism, that is to say, getting a return on capital, has taken control. And there's a new book out by a man named Piketty from France, which makes the case that the rate of return on capital is growing more rapidly than the rate of production. In other words, what's happening is that people get more by investing. They can get more than they can by actually producing. Mm-hmm. Okay? If you have a lot of money, you don't put it into a factory. You don't do it that way. What you do is you invest it in paper, and you do various other things. And there's an imbalance. So that's a question. That is how I would say the present state of, that is one way to view the present state of capitalism in the world.
Would you just say, let me just interrupt just for a second, is that when he talks about the predatory logic of capitalism, is that what you're seeing?
I'm
that
sorry.
It's predatory not to produce but to consume.
I'm sorry he used the word predatory. That's a value judgment, and it presupposes a view of capitalism that I think is unfair. Now,
not everybody at this table agrees with that position.
I'm okay with predatory, Ron.
I would say, a good capitalist wants a return on his investment. A good capitalist works hard. He employs people. She employs people. Does all these things.
Makes a good product.
Does all of these things. And a good capitalist is entitled to his reward. That doesn't mean that he deserves that reward. That doesn't mean that what he or she is doing is consistent with or consonant with the message of Jesus Christ as set forth in the Sermon on the Mount and in the desert and various other places. You see, there are two separate questions.
It's interesting. This does sort of bleed back into what we were looking at earlier with Hobby Lobby.
Yes, no doubt.
Where there was a moral value judgment being made. And that was always the leash, if you will, on the capitalist animal that held it back, was that the individual moral understanding and constraints would constrain that business, we would say, corporation or whatever it is.
You have justifiably criticized me in the past on the air and off because I tend to beat up on capitalists, and I say justifiably.
Thank you.
Okay.
Gently, though.
I'm always gently and always in a fine way. Yes. Now I want to give Mark a chance here, but go ahead. Well, I mean, can I
finish?
Yeah,
finish up on this?
You all are doing this on purpose, by the way, not letting me get in here.
But the point is that you can be a good capitalist, and the larger issue, capitalism is going to do what capitalism is going to do. The larger issue is the view that sets up capitalism as the best way to organize our economic and social life. Is that view itself consistent with the larger message of the Gospels and the Old Testament?
And that's the question.
That's the question.
That's exactly right.
This article is difficult for me to deal with because the guy obviously feels it isn't.
Exactly.
And he's loaded his language and everything else.
Right.
Mark,
Sure.
I now defer.
I'll give you two separate answers because I know we don't have much time. One will be Mark Woods' answer, and the other will be his Mark Woods as Methodist pastor answer. One, has contemporary American capitalism become incompatible with Christian values? Mark would say yes. Methodist pastor Mark would probably say, well, we can't fully embrace capitalism as Christians. I do not think we can fully embrace it. Meaning, I think the best critiques of capitalism are going to come from Christianity itself. It's not going to come from socialism. It's not going to come, dare I say, not from Hegel or Marx or any of these other characters. It's going to come from Christianity, because, and I think I would somewhat agree with Professor Dorian here, that because there are so many inconsistencies here, and I think that so much we have, for so long as American Christians, tried to make capitalism synonymous with Christianity. I'm thinking of Michael Novak, some of these other characters that kind of apologetically enter the conversation of theology and capitalism. And what I have been noticing, the more I have been reading of what's coming out theologically, is we are seeing that we no longer can fully embrace capitalism the way we have before. That it is creating a kind of culture that is sort of anti-Christian, that is sort of against Christianity on some level, which is exactly what the Christians lobbied against Marx and socialism, was it was anti-Christian. But ironically, I think the pendulum is completely swinging the other way, that capitalism is now becoming that thing. So therefore, I would probably agree more with Dorian than I would disagree. But
Mark the philosopher.
Right, that's right. But I have several personalities, right?
Yeah, we have a problem here.
Yeah, that we do. No, but I definitely think that we are so focused on other things. Hobby Lobby is a perfect example of how we are focused on 4 contraceptive things that about abortion, and yet we ignore China, we ignore these other things that, because capitalism is working on some level, and capitalism becomes so pragmatic that we're like, as long as it works, who cares what it means philosophically? And that is I would suggest an anti-Christian position. It's not, does it work? It's, what does it mean for us as people? What does it mean for humanity?
Well, I want to go back to that idea that perhaps it's the other way. You know, you're saying that capitalism has corrupted Christianity.
Not entirely.
But
go ahead, Robert.
You're going there. I mean, that's kind of the thrust of. I would say it. Perhaps it could be looked at the other way around. Is that the collapse of Christianity, if you will, the post-Christian worldviews that we're seeing now are actually unleashing capitalism in a way, and we're going to be talking about this in other segments. We're up to the end of this one, and I'm getting looks right now.
How fun is this, though? I mean, come on, let's be honest.
So, folks, this is a teaser for next week. So we're going to be back next Sunday morning and talking about how our faith matters.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.